Hello and welcome to another edition of Killing the Church, where we do, come on, hard drinks for hard theology. So what was the Christology of the early church? What do we find in pre-literary traditions? What can we know about what the early church thought of Jesus and his relationship in the dynamic of the Godhead? That's what we'll be discussing tonight. But before that, let me bring on my co-host.
Hello.
Hey,
How are you tonight?
doing well. I'm pretty excited for tonight. Actually, I didn't get to prepare very much, but I've got a lot of peanut gallery ready. So
We've talked about this subject 100 times before. You and I are not foreign to any of the concepts we're going to talk about tonight. But this is kind of my area, actually, because now we're going to talk about history. And so it's okay that you didn't prepare as much. First of all, I have total confidence in you. Secondly, this is my area anyway, and so I'll be doing a lot of talking. Whether even if you prepared the most, I would still be talking the most, probably.
Right. So we're switching from last week.
Yeah, we're gonna do a flip flop, a Gucci flip flop, if you will.
Yep. And first and foremost, we have a book giveaway.
We do. So
last month's was Rethinking the Five Soli, and that there was a fair amount of irony behind giving that away last month. This month, what is it?
This month, well, so last month, Rethinking the Five Soli on Reformation Day. This month is a personal favorite of mine. By the way, congratulations to Kara Collins for last month's winning last month's book. It is on the way. This month we have Love and the Messianic Age by the one, the only, may his memory be for a blessing, Paul Philip Levertov, a Hasidic Jew in the late 1800s. Basically found the Gospel of John. Long story short, read it and determined, wow, what a great Hasid. I got to know more about this guy. And he later determined that this, he discovered a New Testament and later determined that this was, and I quote, our book. And he's a, by our, he's saying that it's a Jewish book. And he, I believe, is the grandson to the Balatanya, Shneur Zalman of Liadi.
Wow,
and he went to.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think so. If not, he's like maybe a distant cousin or something, but he's related to the Balatanya in some way. And he went to a prestigious yeshiva. I mean, this guy is a no joke rabbi, very, very educated and very Hasidic as well. And so this book is amazing. It's basically just a short commentary on the Gospel of John and why it's important to understand basic tenets of Hasidus before John is going to make any sense to anybody. And he theorized that essentially the reason why many people don't understand the Gospel of John is because they don't understand Hasidus. And so it's a great book. I always recommend it to those who are wanting to learn more about the book of John in general. Fantastic. Can't wait to give it away. As always, I love doing the book giveaways. So who is with you in spirit tonight?
So I am still working on the Jesse James bourbon, but so tonight I will be also, because I do a Boilermaker pretty much every time. I will be doing a favorite brew of mine, Oktoberfest. I know it's not October anymore, but
doesn't matter.
I pretty much spend all of October doing the pumpkin beers because like November's when they stop selling those, but they still sell Oktoberfest into November. So I typically won't drink that much Oktoberfest until November.
We just picked up a fresh pack of Oktoberfest, and I'm going to save it and milk it as long as possible because it's my number one favorite beer.
Yes.
All right. And
now, how about you, though? I saw you mixing something there.
Yeah, I'm doing, again, hard drinks for hard theology, of course. But this is a Cuba Libre, a classic Cuba Libre with Bacardi white rum and vanilla Coke. I know that's not the classic part, actually, so I should say it's not a classic Cuba Libre.
It's not a classic.
But it's and I don't have a lime. But
See,
it's just
if you get the Bacardi white rum with the lime already in it, then you don't have to have the lime.
it's true. That's fair. But anyway, this is one of my favorite mixed drinks of all time. It's classic. It's good. I mean, you can't go wrong with a classic rum and Coke. So anyway, tonight's episode is going to be dense, to say the least. So I hope everyone has their notebooks ready because, yeah, this is going to get, well, it's not going to be the most dense episode that we've ever done, but it's going to be pretty dense. So you're probably going to want to have like a notebook ready just to have some of this stuff ready. And we will do the meme of the week announcement at the end of the episode. So stay tuned for that.
It's a two for this week because we missed last week.
Yeah, so. We did miss last week. That's right. So we owe you guys.
The meme we chose is one from last week. So
yeah, we're trying to be, we're trying to do this right. Okay. So let's, there's really no way to segue into it. So let's jump right into it. You guys read the title. You understand we're going to talk about some pre-literary traditions and what they tell us about early Christologies. So what is a pre-literary tradition and what do they tell us? It's kind of a short answer. A pre-literary tradition is exactly how it sounds. It is a tradition, a creed, a poem of some sort that existed in a memorized vocal oral form before it was written down. Like the writing down comes after. So it is pre-literary. It is a tradition that is pre-literary. And we know these exist because they eventually do get written down. And when they finally get written down, it's one of those, we have no evidence of it before it finally does get written down, but we see that its existence has always been implied of this particular creed or whatever the pre-literary tradition is. And so this is common. This happens all the time. How long before, I guess, I don't mean to be political, but this is just an example. When deplorables eventually became like a sort of title or battle cry, right, for one particular side of a political movement because of another. And it would later on, that would be sort of written down, but it sort of exists prior to its writing down. That would be like an example of a pre-literary tradition.
Yeah, or another, I guess, another example, like "Make America Great Again," like as a phrase, as a saying, that predates when it was first written down.
Right. Now, the difference is like modern pre-literary traditions don't really count because everything gets recorded immediately. But with a pre-literary tradition, it's going to be very structured. They usually stand alone by themselves. So like we're going to go through some pre-literary traditions that are found in Paul's letters. And they're incredibly structured. And that's one thing that stands out to us. It's how we can sort of tell that it's a pre-literary tradition. They use a certain sentence structure that would be not exactly characteristic of the author writing the letter. It's one of those, like if I'm writing a letter and I quote something from The Hobbit in the middle of my letter, but I don't like cite the quotation. I just say the quote and I expect you, the reader, to understand that I'm quoting The Hobbit, right? Because we're both Lord of the Rings fans, kind of thing. So you would get it right away. You'd be like, "Oh, that's from The Hobbit," but I wouldn't stanz it out in any way. I would just sort of make it because that's something that we would understand. It's like that, but so it would be instantly recognizable as a pre-literary tradition, as something that's not originally the author's, and it usually can stand out from the work. You can pull the quote from The Hobbit out of that letter, and it's a standalone thing. Same with pre-literary traditions in early New Testament documents. These are standalone. You can pull it out of its context, and it doesn't matter. Nothing changes. It doesn't change the way that it reads. It's sort of immaterial to the context of the letter. It is a standalone product.
Right.
They tell us a lot of things. Pre-literary traditions would be used in sort of like a sort of coded way of admitting to one person or another exactly what, your beliefs are, as a sort of communicative way of saying, hey, I'm on your side, or hey, This is what I believe. I'm with you. And we'll get to an example in Romans in a little bit, because actually Paul opens up with one of these pre-literary traditions as a way of saying, as a way of connecting with an audience he's never met before. And so that's another good use for these, and they could probably be found in liturgies. Christian communities, early Christian communities, were likely using a lot of these pre-literary traditions as poetic prayers that they would include in their daily prayers. And then it would eventually get written down in a letter as a way of connecting with that community, to show agreements with a particular thing. That's why I keep saying creed, because it's kind of like a creed. It's a spoken creed. Right. Keep in mind, writing things down is expensive and just not really doable, not really worth doing unless it's something incredibly important.
Yeah, kind of. I guess you could say it's kind of like the Rifleman's Creed. It's a way that that you, as a Marine, could still identify with somebody from another branch of the military who is in a position like say Army infantry, where they also had to recite the Rifleman's Creed. If you were in country, so to speak, and you came across, a soldier, this is a way where you could identify each other as being friendly, so to speak, because you both know the Rifleman's Creed.
Right. It shows you where your allegiance is. So they're important because they exist, or we have evidence of their existence before these letters get written down, some 25 to 30 years after the death of the master. And so we have a 30-year gap of development, and we don't have anything written down to record that development within the early ecclesia, within the early congregation of believers. So pre-literary traditions cue us into what was going on before we finally get that first letter from Paul, right? Like, I think it's First Thessalonians is likely the first one, then Galatians, Romans is definitely one of the later ones. But so it kind of cues us into what's going on because nothing was recorded during that time, which is important. So before we move forward, now everyone has a sort of idea of what a pre-literary tradition is. Now we have to talk about the different types of Christologies. And there are two primary ones. Brad, do you want to introduce us to them both?
Yeah, right. So you've got a high Christology and a low Christology. It is similar to kind of how we discussed last week. There's a high magic and a low magic. There's a high Christology and a low Christology. Low Christology would in effect be one that humanizes Jesus much more so, as I understand it, and not that it humanizes him, but it recognizes more of his humanity, so to speak. Whereas a high Christology deifies him much more so.
Right. Yeah. That's about it, actually. So, high Christology. Yeah. It's basically he's deified. He's pre-existent, pre-incarnate, existed with God in the beginning. It does not always necessarily mean that a high Christology is Orthodox Trinitarian position.
Right.
But at the very least, it means a divinity of some sort. And the level of divinity can obviously be debated.
The idea that Jesus is a separate God from the one God would still be considered a high Christology.
Right.
Yeah.
Because high Christology needs just a couple of things. It needs to imply a pre-existence or a pre-incarnate, pre-incarnation, and a divine status, essentially, of some sort, whether it be like an angel's divine or literally God. But a low Christology is sort of on the other end of that spectrum. It focuses on the humanity of Jesus. And low Christologies are usually, they usually, I mean, I don't think there's anyone, there is a version of low Christology that eventually turns Jesus into a divine being, but there's no pre-incarnation. So he becomes a divine being. And that's still considered a low Christology. But generally speaking, low Christologies are, Jesus is not God. He's human. He was born. He came into existence. He's a creation of God. and he's a human, and he was highly exalted into a really lofty position. Low Christology is obviously a title given to this particular line of thought from high Christology theologians. It's meant to be insulting, but unfortunately, that's the name that stuck. Actually, like what Bart Ehrman does, he refers to it as exaltation Christology, because that's essentially the idea, is that you're exalting a human all the way up to the right hand of God, and that's actually a higher Christology than a pre-incarnation, because of the distance traveled kind of thing.
It's interesting to me how like the like, I don't necessarily want to say early church because that's what we're talking about right now, but you know, the post-apostolic church, they tended to separate things like that. So we have high Christology, and then they called it low Christology because, you know, only the truly clever could conceive of the high Christology, right? And only idiots clung
the lowly
things to a low Christology. The same way they did with magic, is only, you know, only the truly clever people could practice high magic. All of the plebes, they practice low magic.
It's for certain, it's sort of elitist, and that's, you know, it's like what is it, lordship salvation versus easy believism, right? That you can tell that the opposition named the other side's theology because of the way that it's titled. You know, like a pro-lifer would call a pro-choicer anti-life, right? And the pro-choicer is like, well, I'm not anti-life, I'm just pro-choice. You're anti-choice. So they demonize the other side by creating an antithesis to their particular position. And that's how we got high Christology versus low Christology. Right. So you can tell who did the naming there. But so that's kind of the general gist. So what that's going to do is there's a certain couple of different versions of low or exaltation Christology. But for the sake of, I'll switch between the two kind of interchangeably, between low and exaltation Christology. But for the sake of academic purposes, many people are more familiar with calling it a low Christology. So I will continue to use that while periodically reminding the listener that this is also an exaltation theology. That's kind of more descriptive of what's happening rather than just saying low, like, because what it does is low Christology. Oh, well, Christ, like Jesus is merely a man, right? It gives this whole, like, he's just a guy. And that's what the low, that's what you think of when you think low Christology.
When you have to add modifiers to diminish the position as a means of creating a straw man.
Right. Yeah. So, but I will continue using it, but understand in my daily life, I prefer to use the term exaltation theology.
Right.
So there's a couple of different types of this. The main one is going to be adoptionist Christology. And in fact, a lot of them essentially get called this. This is the most popular of the low Christologies. The other ones kind of live in obscurity, and they still are some sort of form of adoptionism in some way, shape, or form. So adoptionist Christology. And actually, I got another Benny here. Boom, adoptionist Christology. This is, and so I've put in the banner, the oldest known Christology. This is basically, and there's no such thing as a unanimous consensus in scholarship. In fact, it wouldn't be scholarship if it was unanimous. If it was unanimous, we tend to go, why? There's always somebody that pushes back on a particular theory. But the majority of scholarship tends to lean that adoptionist Christology, according to the evidence, is the oldest version of Christology that we have. Critical analysis essentially has yielded that this is the majority opinion. So this is kind of an easy one. It's also a little self-explanatory. I have a sort of official definition, but I kind of want to hear how close to that official definition you would come to describing adoptionist theology. So I kind of want to hear what you have to say.
Adoptionist theology is essentially the idea, more or less, that Jesus was born as a human being and was adopted as, and appointed as, and elected as the Son of God later on in his life, either at the baptism of John the Baptist or at the resurrection. I understand there's varying opinions on that.
Yeah, we'll go into that. So actually, you basically hit the nail on the head. It's this idea that that Jesus becomes the Son of God through adoption, which, as you and I both know, in both the Roman and the Jewish world, this is actually an area in which the Roman and Jewish world kind of have a crossfade.
Right.
Because adoptionism in the Jewish world is, I mean, you have basically a bloodborne son.
Right.
Now in Roman times, I'm not sure if this is true, but I know that it, like in like the Judaic version of adoptionism of adoption, you cannot unadopt an adopted child. Like,
nope,
it's not an option.
You chose that.
Right. Yeah. So there's no disowning an adopted son. And so it's not unheard of. Excuse me. It's not a crazy unheard of thing to say that by being adopted as the Son of God would put him in an incredibly exalted status, as though he were always the Son of God. And that's where the waters will start to get muddy over time, as that idea distances itself from the originator. Time moves forward. Other cultures get a hold of the Bible. That fine line to being adopted as the Son of God to having always been the Son of God starts to get a little bit more muddied, and we'll demonstrate that with some more history stuff. We'll throw at you a little bit, but yeah, that's and actually we'll get into that right now. So that's next on my notes. Yeah. So real quick, low Christology, that's the oldest that we know. There are different Andrew Loke in a book he wrote, Origin of the Divine Christology, attests to this, as well as everyone knows Bart Ehrman by now, I feel like, in his book, How Jesus Became God. And Andrew Loke particularly points out, Bart Ehrman does not point this out, but Andrew Loke seems to particularly point out that high Christology doesn't really develop until around about the book of John, the Gospel John. So late in the 1st century, early 2nd century. So there are adoptionists who subscribe to pre-birth selection, or does it? Oh, this is a question.
Yes.
Are there adoptionists who subscribe to pre-birth selection, or does it have to be sometime during his life?
So if there were, I would say they probably lean very Calvinist. And there probably are, or there probably even were back in this time period, because if we understand that, that time is not a concept to God, then this would certainly be a philosophical point worth contending with. But if I go to an orphanage and I meet a child that I say, okay, well, I'm gonna adopt that child, there is the pre-selection there, but it still hasn't happened yet.
So to sort of I guess make a clarification here, to answer the question, there is a version of adoptionism in which there is also a pre-incarnation, but it is have to be very specific, because usually pre-incarnation also implies divinity. But there is a version of adoptionist theology where the pre-incarnation is sort of like, well, the soul of the Messiah existed as part of creation. It was created. And then eventually the Messiah's soul enters a body. And then that body, after it's fulfilled its mission, receives the adoption of sons into the holy family of the divine in heaven. So that is a version that exists, and that is one that we actually start to see in Pauline letters. We do sort of see that idea of a pre-incarnation but non-divine figure, and we're actually going to get to a passage that's incredibly popular that goes over exactly this. So it's actually, Bobby brings up a really good question, and it's good that we get a chance to clarify.
Bobby.
Yeah, Bobby's the man. He's my favorite Trinitarian.
Bobby Church.
So, but yeah, high Christology sort of develops around the time of the Gospel of John and onwards. So we're talking 95 CE and so late first, early second century. And that's again, Andrew Locke sort of talks about that. There's other sources, but that's going to be the main one I'm drawing from. So let me see what else we got here. Oh, so it's important to know. This is a Trinity episode. That this one of our arguments is going to be this is the oldest known Christology. By the time high Christology starts to trickle in, all of the apostles are already dead. And that's kind of our point, is that the apostles in no way indicate a high Christology in anything that we have in early Christian writings, in pre-literary traditions. All of the pre-literary traditions are a low Christological point of view. And it is not until after all the apostles have died, after the destruction of the Second Temple and moving into the Second Jewish Revolt, where the parting of ways begins to happen, that we start to see a high Christology develop. And actually, Andrew Locke, again, he's a good resource, but he does point out that this might be due in part because the Gentile world, with their preconceived, pagan experiences, are simply bringing what they already know and understand into the New Testament as they have it, which eventually leads to a deification of a person, which is not uncommon in a Greek culture or a Roman one for that matter. And so they don't, even though they would be willing, and actually Barterman makes this clarification as well, many Greeks would be willing to say, yeah, I believe in the one true God, but also Jesus is also God. Like they don't see that as a contradiction in their mind, because it computes to them in a different way, having come from this strongly, pantheistic, pagan background. And this is not an episode where I go, everything is pagan. I'm not doing that. I hate when people do that, because not everything is pagan. It's not how that works. And we can't blame, and I hate doing this too. And so I want to make clear up front, actually, I am not one that blames paganism for the Trinity. I don't usually do that. I blame the influence that pagan thinkers have had on the Trinity, but I don't say things like the Trinity is pagan and it was just adopted. No, it's very clearly not something that was pulled and then dropped on the church. It is something that is developed over a long period of time, and there's Greek influence and thought that creates that. And in a way, you could blame that on paganism, but you can't say this is pagan and they just inserted it. That's not how that happened. That's not how that worked. The Trinity is not pagan in origin per se, at least not the Orthodox Trinity that we have.
Yeah, no. One of the only examples historically that I can think of actually would be surrounding the person of Mithras and Sol, and I forget what other deity, but essentially the idea of father, son, and mother, where there's a level of conflation in not the Roman rendition, but actually the much older Zoroastrian rendition, where essentially Mithras and the sun deity ultimately become conflated with one another and indistinguishable from one another. But it'd be very hard to tie that directly to the development of the Trinity.
Yeah, I just don't like. It's simply not a true statement. And plus, when you make that statement, a scholar could easily pick that apart. An apologist, particularly, could easily pick that apart, because there's no smoking gun. There's nothing that can say, aha, see, here's the Trinity, just with different names, from a pagan culture, and here's a clear indication that it was adopted. You're not going to get any of that. That's not how any of this works. It is very clearly a developed doctrine over time. Many true New Testament scholars will tell you, as time goes on, the theology gets more and more sophisticated, more complicated, and more thought out. And so that's where we start to see the Trinity develop as a result of certain things being sort of stamped as this is a fact. And so it's a natural thing. It's like, well, if this is a fact, well, then that means, and you kind of go from one fact and you create a chain logic, right? Like linear logic. And that goes from one thing to another. This is actually how Mary becomes the mother of God at the Council of Ephesus, because it's like, well, if Jesus is perfectly sinless and God, well, then Mary had to be perfectly sinless, and if she's perfectly sinless and she's the mother of God, right? So she's also sin. It's kind of, but it develops that kind of procession takes time, based on the idea of like, because at Council of Ephesus, we're talking 431 CE. So
it's the danger of the if-thens. It's funny, actually. I was just discussing last week with a friend of mine. I've referenced him before, but my secular Jewish friend, who I love discussing with him, because like he makes me work for an answer, because even though he's secular, he's still got a Jewish mind, right?
Yep.
Still high functioning. And we were discussing the problem of if-thens, right? Because it usually begins with an already errant statement. And because of the implications of that errant statement, you have to go, well, if then, and it just leads to this long string of things that give so many conclusions so far removed from the initial statement. And that's essentially what happened when Yeshua became deified. It's like, all right, well, we began with that. Okay, he is God, and then that led to a long string of several if then. To where now Mary is the mother of God, and a number of other theologies that we just don't find in the Bible.
And that's actually, as we get to, this is a good time to talk about it, the backwards movement of Christology. The oldest form that we have is adoptionism at his resurrection. And that pulls us right into Romans chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. So let me go ahead and
get that
out. You got it up?
I got it up. I've got all of them up.
Oh, go ahead and read it.
Okay. Yep. Romans 1, 3 through 4 in the HCSB. That's the one I've got all of them pulled up in. Concerning his son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was a descendant of David according to the flesh, and who has been declared to be the powerful Son of God by the resurrection from the dead according to the Spirit of holiness. Okay,
so a couple of things. This is a great example of a pre-literary tradition. This is actually the quintessential example of a pre-literary tradition. First of all, it's chiastic in structure. And you'll actually see that, like my Bible here, the TLV, I'm not sure if you can see. Yeah, right here, you can see that it's done the chiasm for you. Like you can actually see the chiastic structure in the poem.
Oh, that's cool.
Great. Yeah, so I love the TLV for that. But so here's so concerning his son, and actually my translation is different. So the HCSB must be using alternate sources and stuff like that. So concerning his son, he came into being from the seed of David, according to the flesh. He was appointed Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection of the dead. So there's their, essentially, this is the reason that this is the quintessential is Paul doesn't talk like this. First of all, this is the only example in which you see him use the phrase Spirit of holiness rather than Holy Spirit.
Right.
And actually that is interesting in and of itself, because that phrase, the Spirit of holiness, is usually how Greek renders Semitic speech.
Right.
So by that, I mean, Ruach HaKodesh is like the Holy Spirit. Greek usually would render that in like the Spirit of holiness, because HaKodesh, even though it means the holy, it's like the holiness. In the definite article, even though it's on the word holy, it's in application to the Ruach particularly. And so that's very Semitic. So this creed was likely composed first in Hebrew, which is interesting. So this is very Hebraic pre-literary tradition.
This is actually one, and again, this is a matter of dispute that even here at Alternate Media, we have a stance, but it's a matter of research here. But this is one of those where it becomes clear that even Paul doesn't seem to be aware of the concept of a virgin birth here, which is a quintessential part of building the Trinity, right? When Paul uses the words, who was a descendant of David according to the flesh, that means that Paul's idea was that he was an actual physical descendant of David through a patrilineal line.
Right.
That's what Paul was under the impression of.
Well, so interestingly enough, this is just a scholastic speech. Basically, this is a pre-literary tradition. So this is a creed, excuse me, and it's likely the oldest creed that we have. He starts out his letter with this creed in order to build a relationship with a community at Rome whom he has not visited yet. When he writes this letter, he's actually writing a letter for the first time to a community he has not yet been to.
Right.
So that's what makes Romans special. It's very detailed, because he actually doesn't have an established relationship with this community yet. So he basically creates a theological dissertation in order to establish that. And he starts out with a creed in order to say, hey, I'm on your side. We all say this thing, and I know you guys are familiar with it. So here's the creed. Concerning his son, he came into being from the seed of David, according to the flesh. But so the primary thing we want to focus on is he was appointed, or he was made son of God. That word "in power" is actually debated. There's evidence that seems to suggest that "in power" was added by Paul. So we don't know if that was in the original creed. It doesn't seem to have been in the original creed, but he was appointed Ben Elohim in power, according to the Ruach of holiness, the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. And so this is the pre-literary tradition that indicates that he was adopted. This is adoption Christology at the resurrection.
Yeah.
And that's the way that the creed reads. He was made son of God at the resurrection by the Spirit of holiness, by basically the Holy Spirit. Like, that's the ominous dominus. And so this is a great example. This is, again, sort of the oldest example that we think we have. A lot of scholars, again, have agreed that this is the oldest creed. Likely the oldest creed. We don't ever know anything for sure. The more you study, the less sure of anything you become, they say. But that's our main point, is like, from this point forward, we are going to see a backwards movement of this adoptionism. So right now we have it at his resurrection, and there are other pre-literary traditions and other things that Paul writes where he seems to indicate that it's at the resurrection he becomes the Son of God, or he becomes Messiah at the resurrection, whatever it is. And then later on, as things progress, it'll be so we're talking now like Gospel of Luke, or rather Matthew, he becomes Son of God at the baptism, right? So at his resurrection, now moving back in time, he becomes Messiah, Son of God at the baptism. In Luke, we seem to get an indication that he becomes Messiah, adopted by God at his birth, right? And then in John, now we have the pre-incarnation. He's the Son of God, adopted by God, what have you, depending on how you want to interpret John 1, at creation. And so there's actually a backwards movement over time when he becomes Messiah, Son of God, depending on where. And a lot of Pauline letters seem to indicate that it was at either the resurrection or at the baptism. But Paul leans very heavy on the resurrection, and so we're going to use a lot of Pauline evidences for that. The other ideas come from the Gospels, which again, every single Gospel was written after Paul. Paul's long dead by the time we get our first Gospel, and then that's when we start to see the backwards movement of Christology going from low to high, right? His death, resurrection, his baptism, all the way up until he's God, co-eternal, right? So that's that low to high sort of progression that we're going to see throughout history until about 300 years of development before he finally gets all the way up to the top. So you said you had all of them pulled up?
Yep.
Perfect. So which ones? So now we're going to move into Acts. I don't want to waste a whole lot of time in this because I actually want to get to our last example. So which one in Acts do you want to go through?
Ooh, man, what a good question.
Maybe just 13? 13,
Yeah,
32,
probably.
33?
Yeah, probably just 13.
So real quick, Luke authored all of the speeches in Acts. Now, this is nothing crazy. Luke, and this is what historians used to do. He likely wasn't there for every speech, so he had to author the speeches himself by using traditions and by word of mouth as he gathered information on what was said at this particular speech. And Luke particularly uses a lot of pre-literary traditions to recreate some of these speeches. Which is important because essentially this indicates that, one, the pre-literary tradition was likely thought of in and around the time of the speech, and the speech reflects whatever the pre-literary tradition is. Again, all historians at this time do this. A great example of this is Peter's speech in Acts chapter 2. He gives this long speech. It's highly structured. It's perfect Greek. And it's very Greek, and that's another indicator. He likely spoke Hebrew at his speech in Acts chapter 2, Hebrew or Aramaic. And so when we get to the speech in Acts, it's in really, really good, perfectly grammared Greek. So it doesn't seem to be a transliteration or a translation of a Hebrew speech. And then the Greek would reflect that it's not perfect, but it rhymes. It's very poetic. It uses very flowy. It's good. It's clearly authored by Luke, capturing the idea of what Peter said. And he likely used the pre-literary traditions because they're already structured. They're already beautifully written to help recreate some of these speeches. So Acts chapter 13, verses 32 and 33 are just such an example.
Yep.
Do you want to read it?
Yeah. Let's see. And we ourselves proclaim to you the good news of the promise that was made to our ancestors. God has fulfilled this for us, their children, by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the second Psalm, "You are my son, today I have become your father."
Yeah. So, once again, pre-literary tradition. A lot of scholars look at this and they're like, all right, it stands out. It's very creedal in nature. It's highly structured. It's chiastic. And it's written in beautiful Greek. And so Luke is likely using a tradition to recreate a speech here. And this is actually Paul once again speaking. So we're trying to stick with sort of Pauline ideas because he seems to be the most articulate when it comes to a lot of these Christological things. Yeah. I've been very academic up until just then. Things. But so yeah, I'll read my translation and we'll stop and go. And we proclaim to you good news. The promise to the fathers has arrived. All right. So there's this part of that chiastic structure. Now we have a promise to the fathers. So there's that fatherly aspect. For, this is actually very Hebrew, and it's like Hebrew creeds love to start with for or key in Hebrew. For God has fulfilled this promise to the children, children, to us by raising up Yeshua. This is a resurrection. And also written in the second Psalm, you are my son, children again. Today I've become your father, full circle. Right, so father, children, father. That's kind of the structure we see here. And the middle is the raising up of Yeshua. So that seems to indicate that he becomes adopted as the Son of God at his resurrection via the "today I have begotten you," and in the same sentence, the resurrection of Yeshua. So that's another example of a pre-literary tradition being recorded by Luke. Luke has a bunch of other pre-literary traditions all over the book of Acts. Excuse me. And some of them tend to contradict, actually. Luke doesn't seem to see a problem with this because Luke is just recording traditions as they are handed to him. He doesn't care that they contradict. He's just going to give you what he got. And so some of these pre-literary traditions, like Acts chapter, I think 2 for Peter's speech, will contradict another area that's also a pre-literary tradition. But, he's just putting sources together. He's not redacting anything. He's just leaving it as it is. And he doesn't seem to have a problem with that, like a good historian should, actually. So we're glad that Luke did this. And that's where we also have this idea that there's a backwards movement of Christology from low to high over time. Luke is one of the indicators that we can start to see some of those things happen. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, because the next one is going to be the focus of this episode, even though we spent 45 minutes on everything else. So Philippians 2, 6 through 11. Boy, do we get this one all the time.
Yeah. A lot.
Yeah. And so I love this one, because this sort of gives us a chance to explain why we don't like using translations. We try to encourage people to focus more on the original, and if you can, try to get some historical context into that as well, to help aid the understanding of the passage.
Yep.
A little hard to do, especially with like letters like Philippians as an example, because we're not Philippians. So he's writing a letter to a congregation he's established a relationship with. So it's actually hard. We don't know what that relationship was like. We don't know what he was already teaching to them yet. And so recreating what they know, what their presuppositions were going into the letter, is a little difficult, oftentimes impossible. But we're going to focus on this passage for the remainder of our episode.
So, Philippians 2, 6 through 11. Who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a slave, taking on the likeness of men. And when he had come as a man in his external form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on the cross. For this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Okay, so that's a long one. This one's colloquially known as the poem, or the Christ poem, because it's a whole poem. Not only is it a pre-literary tradition, as is argued by most scholars, but it is an entire poem. It's very highly structured. We saw some things that are paralleled. It makes much more sense in the Greek when you see the parallelisms. This is not so much a chiastic structure. This is more like A, B, C, A prime, B prime, C prime sort of structure. And a great example of this is, so our different English translations render this a different way, but in Greek, it's the same word. Verse 6, who though existing in the form of God, or in the appearance of God, it's morphe. And then at the end of verse 7, and being found in appearance as a man, it's the same in the appearance. So there's this parallel sort of structure, A and A prime, B, B prime, C, C prime. And that
was the word what?
Morphe.
Somebody get James White on the phone and make sure that we're pronouncing that correctly, so he doesn't have a conniption. He's now come to the point of the episode where he has something of value to contribute.
the correct dialect of the Greek, whatever. I love that.
I couldn't resist.
No, I know it's like the first thing I said was, okay, my Greek pronunciation sucks, but here it goes. And then he goes,
remember,
yeah,
hard drinks, hard theology. Soft drinks, go to James White.
Soft theology. So this is an interesting one. So the biggest problems we're going to run into, who existing in the form of God did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, becoming the likeness of man, and being found in the appearance of a man, humbled himself. Okay, so we're going to actually focus on verse 6, because verse 6 is by far the worst translated verse of all of them. Very few English translations get this one right. And it's largely because, and this is where it's important, you need to know the bias of any translation you use. The HCSB is a Trinitarian translation. I love that translation. It is the most honest of all the translations I've used in the past. But I believe even the HCSB makes the same biased connection here as we're going to explain. So let's see here. The problem is going to be the first word, morphe. And this is basically the word for appearance, okay? Or form. Form is not a bad translation of it, but it's weird that later it becomes appearance of man instead of appearance of God. Once we have that phrase, we will automatically see the first problem that we're going to run into. Being in the appearance of God. God has no appearance. He has no body. He has no form. He's non-corporeal. Yeah. But by leaving it as form of God, you leave that little area of, well, he's basically God. That's sort of what it means. Like, that's how the English reader thinks of it. But if we leave it as in the appearance, then that creates our first problem. You look like you had something to say there.
No. I was just, yeah. Like, what does that mean, to be in the appearance of God, or to have the appearance of God? What is that?
Go ahead and why don't you explain that one to us? Actually, I feel like you have the answer.
Well, it's very simple for anybody who's done historical research in Jewish philosophy on what godliness looks like and what it looks like to act the way that God would, right? Mm-hmm. And that is very simply to obey the commandments, right? To obey the commandments means that in the moment that you're obeying them, you are acting as God would, ergo demonstrating the appearance of God to another human being. So naturally, somebody with the perfect observance that Yeshua had would be consistently and continually in the appearance of God, because he would have been continuously and always obeying.
Yeah. Anyone, and actually, so this brings us to that. I think it's in the Talmud. What does it mean to cleave to the Holy One? How does one cleave to an all-consuming fire? And the Talmud answers by attaching oneself to a Torah scholar. And the idea is, by attaching yourself to a Torah scholar, you ipso facto attach yourself to God, because the Torah scholar is existing in the form of godliness. He is existing in the appearance of, or the expression of, the Torah, which is godliness. And so by attaching to him, you attach to God. It's sort of an agency factor. And that is a Talmudic precept. That's why discipleship is so important in the Hebrew mind. You specifically become a disciple of somebody, of a Torah scholar, because that's how you cleave to God himself, because there's no other way to do it. So that's important. Now, the best way to translate morphe, in my opinion, is going to be expression, existing in the expression of God. Now, we've had this conversation a bunch of times already, but I want to note that in the Greek, the definite article for the first theon is not there. For the first theos. Theo. So because it's not definite, one possible rendering is existing in the expression of divinity or godliness. It is very possible to leave that as an expression, as a translation, because of the lack of the definite article. But that aside, let's pretend that it's there anyway, or that it's implied, which is very possible. It's totally possible to have the lack of a definite article and still be clearly talking about God. That doesn't change the meaning. Existing in the expression of God. Very, very Hebrew thought. That's what you would want the Mashiach to be. You would want him to exist in the expression of God and godliness. So no problem there. So far, so good. did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped. This is where the translation really, really falls apart. And so let me get some. So those of you who have notebooks, you're going to want to write some stuff down because this is where we want to talk about some grammar. And I'm going to read, this is from Uriel ben Mordechai's volume 1 in the end of If the End of a Messianic Lie. But harpagmon, which you see on the bottom of your screen there, is that word for to be robbed or to be grasped. It's a very rare Greek word. Again, another indication that this is a pre-literary tradition because it's a word that Paul never uses. And it's rare even in the Greek language. Everywhere that it's used, however, it always indicates attempting to take something that you do not have possession of. And so, especially when in conjunction with the negative, which is where, so we're going to explain. So the only problem with this understanding, and I'm reading now, is that harkapagmon is being treated like a verb in this sentence. However, it's a noun, and you can look it up. You can double check this. Go to Blue Letter Bible, click on the word harkapagmon, and you will see harpagmon, excuse me, and you will see that it is a noun. It is in fact a noun. It's not a verb, and so the word not is supposed to be attached to this particular to a verb instead of a noun. It's super weird. The syntax is the reason why it becomes very confusing, but it's a thing. It's a noun. It's not a verb, and so variations on the word can refer to a robbery, a grabbed object, something obtainable. But because of the negative, the not, right? When you attach this to the noun, it is something that is unobtainable. So not to be obtained, unobtainable. It is an unobtainable thing. It is a noun. It is a thing. So this is an unobtainable thing. So, what ends up happening is with these Trinitarian translations, again, not every translation does this, but they put the not in front of the verb consider or regard instead of in front of the noun where it belongs, which is it's actually attached to the noun in the Greek. So what you get is Yeshua did not consider being equal to God as robbery. This is the way that it should be rendered if we leave it in the Greek syntax the way that it is, and reading into the noun. Yeshua did consider being equal to God as something unobtainable or unrobbable, something he cannot grasp. The author here has by force or otherwise, because this word is also used in the Greek language when we do see it in extra biblical literature in conjunction with a usurper, mutiny, somebody trying to take kingship from somebody else. This is the word that is usually used, which is actually very appropriate. So basically, this opening sentence, Yeshua presumed that equality with God was something that was impossible to obtain, even for someone who has possessed the advantage of being the Messiah designee, and deserving of the authority of God or of a God. Doesn't matter. Which brings me to the point I want to make from Bart Ehrman's book here. 234 here. I know we're running really short on time, so I'm trying to get through this. I've read this on this channel before, but I'll read it again. It's from his book, How Jesus Became God, starting on page 233, bottom of the page. When the earliest Christians talked about Jesus becoming the Son of God at his resurrection, they were saying something truly remarkable about him. He was made the heir of all that was God's. He exchanged his status for the status possessed by the Creator and the ruler of all things. He received all of God's power and privileges. He could defy death. He could forgive sins. He could be the future judge of the earth. He could rule with a divine authority He was, for all intents and purposes, God, an agent of God. So that's why this particular poem makes a lot of sense. That being considered, he's basically equal to God by the authority given to him, just like Joseph was to Pharaoh. But he considered that equality as something that he could not obtain. And instead of treating himself like an equal to God, he humbled himself and became like a servant. And then the poem goes on, taking on being in the form of a man, or being in the appearance as a man, versus being in the appearance as God. And so when you put the negative in its ook, I think it's ook is how auk is how you would say it in Greek. The word not back in front of the noun where it belongs, harkapagmon. Then you get the correct rendition of the way that the verse should read. And again, a lot of translations really, I wouldn't say butcher, but really kind of do a disservice to the way that they render by putting not in front of considered. So once again, just to be clear, it should be rendered more closely to that Yeshua did consider being equal to God as something unobtainable by force or otherwise. And that's the difference from what most translations read, who through existing in the form of God did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped. The word not is in the wrong place, essentially. And following the Greek syntax, the not should go in front of that noun. Okay, so that one's rough. I know that one's a little hard to go through. And let me see if I got anything else I want to add. I think that's it for that particular verse. I did want to spend the most time on that one because of all the Greek, grammar we have to go through. It might be a little hard to grasp when I'm literally speaking Greek to somebody. But once again, if we move on to verse 9, for this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. So once again, we have exaltation theology. We have a low Christology. Once again being here, that every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the sea. And this is actually a quote from Isaiah, which is actually talking about the God. It actually is talking about Hashem, and it is being used in parallel with the Messiah. And there's not a problem here. Again, he's basically, for all intents and purposes, God. And so that's not really problematic. The poem writer is using that parallelism to show that, he's basically equal, or existing, not considered equal, but he has all of the authority given to him by God as though he were an equal. And then at the very end, that Yeshua Messiah is Lord to the glory of God the Father. So it is a throughput, not a atput. Like, they're not equal side by side and the worship goes to both. It is through to the Father. And so there is a very clear, again, the Joseph analogy is the best. He was second only to Pharaoh. So he's basically, for all intents and purposes, Pharaoh. And everything he does and everything people do for him is through him to the glory of Pharaoh. Like, that's how that would work. And the poem is, again, very poetic. It's very structured. And it seems to be working with that. But verse 9, God highly exalted him and gave him a name above all other names. And that's the part that we wanted to focus on, because that is low Christology. That is exaltation theology, or Christology, excuse me. Okay. That one was rough. I'm sorry. Sorry, not sorry. We needed to go through that one.
Yes. No, it was necessary.
Yeah. And once again, the verse prior to it, verse 5, let this mind be in you that was also in the Messiah Yeshua. And then that poem goes on. And so, he's let it be that same mind that was in him be in you, be equal to God? Obviously not. Heaven forbid. Chas v'shalom. That is, unless the verse is rendered correctly. And then that authority, even if it was given to you, you would never consider equality with God something that you could even grasp. In which case, if that's the mind that should be in you that is also in Messiah Yeshua, makes perfect sense. Totally fits the context, and that's why Paul quotes the poem immediately after saying, "Let this mind be in you." So it all comes together.
Yep. We are 5 minutes past the hour, though, which, again, not sorry.
Not sorry.
That definitely needed to be gone over. But the chat is now open up for questions.
Yeah. We're already over, so we'll go a little over for some questions.
Absolutely.
Ask your questions.
And while waiting for questions, let's go ahead and do that meme of the week, though.
Oh, that's right. Let me get that. Talk while I get that ready.
Austin says 5 minutes past the hour for a Trinity discussion. Who would have thought?
Listen here, you. All right, let me get this open. Will this work?
It's like, yeah, nobody saw that coming.
Oh, so of the, I don't know which one this one's from, but of them all, this one's my favorite one. Of the two that we have, this one's my favorite one. So let me get rid of this. Share screen so you can show. I don't know which week this one is, but here we go. Meme of the week.
That was this past week. That's for this week.
Oh, okay. That's easily my favorite one. Yeah,
that's epic.
Yeah, that's a very whoever. I don't know where this one came from, but who did this one? So we have to announce the winner.
Oh, hang on.
Whoever did this one, fantastic. For those of you who don't get it, it's from the Reformation. This is Martin Luther nailing his 95 Thesis right to the door of a church, but instead it says, "Dear Chick-fil-A," he's in front of a Chick-fil-A. "Dear Chick-fil-A, Sabbath is Saturday. Please adjust your store hours. Thank you, hungry Sabbath keepers everywhere."
That was Tea with Kara.
Beautiful. She's
been working hard for a win.
She's been working hard trying to get that. Congratulations, you got it this week.
I think it's awesome. It's between her and Gil. They're a married couple, and they compete with each other for meme of the week. It's great.
And then this was the second one.
Her husband.
Of course.
That's Gil.
1 for 1. Now, this one's not a particularly religious one, but it is funny. So
it is hilarious.
So congratulations, Gil, to that one.
Guillermo.
And now,
yes. Shout out to our wonderful heretics.
Yes. So we'll take this moment here to I'll come back in frame. This episode has been brought to you by our wonderful heretics. Excuse me. And man, that rum and coke is not wanting to stay down.
Getting you, huh?
Just the carbonation. So let's see. Yeah. Anyway, thank you to all of our wonderful supporters. You guys seriously rock. You help us do these giveaways that really bless people when they get these books. They're a big help. Even if it's a small help, they don't have to worry about going and get the book themselves. They can just be blessed with a free version of it. And you'd be amazed at what that does for a person. So thank you. You make the company stay alive. And you give suggestions for episodes like these. And so thank you. And if you want to be a supporter of the channel, please consider becoming one. Support at any level. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. That's the easiest way to support us. If you want to help give to us monetarily, there's links in the description below. You can do so on our website, ultimatemedia.com, or on our Patreon /ultimatemedia. And giving at any level gives you access to exclusive content. Mine and his commentaries. He's got commentary on Genesis. I'm still working on a commentary for Mark from a historian's perspective. So there's tons of exclusive content. And you get to hang out with us in the after parties, which I'm going to bring up the banner for that now. Where is it? After parties. So those of you, we have a Discord, and after the show, we hang out with all of our supporters at any level. You can join into the Discord and just hang out with us. You can ask us a question about the show, about the topic. You can roast us. We can sit in awkward silence. Whatever you guys want to do. You pay for that time. We hang out with you for about an hour at least, and sometimes it goes longer than that because we're just chilling. We've actually made a lot of really cool friends. Bobby, I'm looking at you, through the after parties. And many others. Gil is another really good guy. Really glad that we've met him through this ministry. T with Kara, his wife, lots of people. Misty, she's in the chat, and she'll likely be in the after parties. A lot of really great people. We have an amazing community. That Discord rocks. The people there are great. So even if you're not a member supporting the channel monetarily, still join the Discord, link in the description below. There's we're on there very frequently. We monitor it, and so if you have questions, comments, concerns, whatever, or you just want a place to hang out with fellow Torah keeping people, hey, whatever you want to do, consider doing it.
Hit a few questions real quick before we call it.
Yeah.
Misty did say, "Whoo, that was a lot to chew on. Is there going to be a part 7?" Yes, there will be.
Mm-hmm.
This is by far not going to be the last one. Where you notice we're kind of moving forward through history and through the text of the Bible. So we started with Old Testament passages, moved through the Old Testament, moved through the New Testament. Now we're on to pre-literary traditions. We'll get into a lot more historicity in some of the next episodes. In development of in how the high Christology developed through history, and some of the condemning evidence is there.
Yeah. This will probably be at least a 10-part series. Yeah. So there will definitely be. Now, we're not only a Trinitarian based channel where all we do is sit here and debunk the Trinity. And so we tend to do like one Trinity video a month. And actually we've taken a hiatus, but we also took a 2-week vacation for Sukkot in October. So we're just, but once a month you'll get another Trinity video, and it will be, if not this dense, denser.
Right. And let's see, had one more here. Is there a translation that is close to how you guys just broke that down? No.
Not that I'm aware. I think the Young's literal might, but I actually have to double check. I don't think so. A lot of commentaries will show some of this discrepancy in translations, but the problem is, and we say this a lot of translations are Trinitarian translations. So there are some things that, and this is not the only passage, where we basically have to go back into the Greek to investigate to see if the English is doing a service to the Greek. This is an example of that. But just about every translation out there is Trinitarian in nature. It has a Trinitarian bias. So there are some times, I think Romans actually 9 is a great example of this, where the Greek can actually go either way. Like if you break it down and you really look at the Greek, it could go one way or the other. So you have to choose, because you can't have it both ways. So you have to pick one or the other. And if you're a Trinitarian, you're going to pick the more Trinitarian sounding one. Right. And even Tim Hegg has a commentary on Romans where he breaks this down. And he's like, here are 8 possibilities on how it could read. The Greek is vague enough that all 3 of them are equally valid. I choose this one, even though it's outside of Paul's character to say such a thing in all of his letters, but I choose it because I'm Trinitarian. And Tim Hegg is very honest about that. He's like, I choose this translation because I'm Trinitarian. But he says it's equally valid to be non-Trinitarian, and many scholars do render it as non-Trinitarian because many scholars believe that Paul was not Trinitarian. So Tim is being very honest, and he reveals his bias, gives you his opinion, and shows you the counter evidence. I love Tim Hegg for that. But that's just an example. You're not going to find a non-Trinitarian translation unless we make one, and I have no plans to do that.
Oh, All right.
Oh, and this one real quick. For another time. That's going to be a whole another thing.
That's a whole discussion about where that idea comes from.
But the only reason we brought it up is because none of the pre-literary traditions mention a virgin birth. And that's the only reason we brought it up, because it appears as though Paul is not aware of it. Many scholars have said that Paul likely is not aware of it because he never mentions it. Every scholar has a different opinion. We will do an episode dedicated to that concept on why PLTs, pre-literary traditions, don't have a virgin birth in the creed, where later creeds would develop that in the creed. So we will have an episode to that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, other than that, so he says all in favor of Trinitarian videos being an hour and a half long.
Yeah.
We're already pushing it 15 minutes from, but we don't want to keep anybody any longer than necessary. We do want to get to the after partes because we always have fantastic discussion there. So definitely hit the like and subscribe button. And if you want to be a financial supporter and get access to a lot of the perks that come with that, either visit our website or visit our Patreon. Links will be in the description. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And with that said, L'chaim.
L'chaim.